Well, thanks very, very much, Susan. I'm delighted to be here. I'd like to acknowledge that we in the LU especially are cognizant of the fact that we're always on unceded territory, the Musqueam people. And so it's our good fortune to be here today. This is a subject that is so close to my heart. And one of the reasons I actually was so thrilled to accept the kind of unexpected and remarkable invitation from Dean Averill to come back to UBC and actually have the first job of my life was because I really believe so strongly in this idea of public scholarship, obviously. You know, 2 or 3 years ago, Forbes magazine ranked anthropology, which is my discipline, as the worst undergraduate major to go through if you wanted to get a job. Now, think about that for a minute. How can the study of culture and humanity be bad preparation for life? But on the other hand, in the wave of indignation that swept through anthropology departments across North America, no one noticed that there was a kernel of truth to that. And the kernel of truth was the extent to which anthropology, as just one of the social sciences, had effectively marginalized itself over the years, not universally, but generally. And the great example of that I recall is that I was living in Washington, D.C., and in the immediate wake of 9/11, 4,000 anthropologists gathered there for the American Anthropological Association annual meetings. 4,000 anthropologists in the capital of the United States in the wake of the biggest story of culture they or the country would ever face. And the entire gathering earned but a single line in the Washington Post newspaper in the style or the gossip section that essentially said, "The nutcases are in town again." And you honestly didn't know who was more remiss. The government for not listening to the one profession that could actually, with some considerable wisdom and insight, have answered the question on the lips of all Americans at that time, why do they hate us? Or even worse in a way, the discipline itself, which had very quickly cobbled together some ad hoc symposia that were fascinating, but they had no capacity or even inclination or reflex to speak or reach out with its considerable wisdom to the world at large. Now think about this. You know, Jerry Brown famously said about the war on terrorism, you know, how do you win a war on a technique? And how many talk shows have you seen since 9/11 that have been littered with self-professed terrorism experts? I don't know what university they go to become a terrorism expert, but have you ever seen an anthropologist? And yet every single conflict, not only of those dreadful wars, but virtually every conflict on the world today is essentially a clash of culture. And yet anthropology has been sort of remarkably mute. And I happen to come from a tradition where my undergraduate mentor, David Maybury Lewis, had founded Cultural Survival at Harvard while I was an undergraduate. And he was from a long lineage of anthropologists going back through Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict and Kroeber, and of course to the incomparable Franz Boas, for whom activism was an integral part of the mandate of anthropology. Anthropologists, often colored as sort of, you know, tools of colonialism, were just as often intermediaries between indigenous societies and a greater world that was in the midst of crushing them. So anthropology has always had this activist thing, so I was sort of nursed on that. But the other statistic that Susan mentioned, which is so dramatic, is the fact that of those who go through a university system and get a PhD, 80% will not stay within the academy. And yet the pedagogies that we have, not just here at UBC, but in my experience at universities across the country, are still rooted in the 1970s or 60s, when the expectation that a PhD would go on to join the cadre of professors. And so the question becomes, what are we doing for the 80%? And is this any kind of argument not to go through a PhD program? On the contrary. But what we should be thinking about is, how do we make that 80% entrepreneurs of knowledge? And how do we find ways that we can help them develop skill sets that will allow them to monetize that considerable knowledge, not only to enhance their career prospects, but more essentially for the society at large, exactly like that graph is. You took the words out of my mouth. How do we make these disciplines more relevant in a world where increasingly there is government oversight on public funds going to universities? When I first got here, I went to a thesis defense, a mock thesis defense of a young anthropologist who was about to get her PhD, brilliant young woman, but she was giving a public presentation and nobody had ever taught her how to speak publicly. She was fumbling around with index cards in the way that we used to do in grade 7. Well, we live in the era of TED, and I'm on the board of TED, and the TED Talks have now been the standard. If you want to be a preacher and preach from the pulpit, if you want to be a CEO of an NGO and speak to your board or your donors, if you want to be a corporate executive and speak to your stockholders, you can't put up those PowerPoints anymore. You know, the gold standard of public discourse has been set by TED, and it's like a virus that has infected the Western world and the international world. And so all of our students should be able to do a TED Talk. Now, I was very fortunate that I went to a boarding school that one of the very few ways you could get off campus was to join the debating team. So naturally, I became a very good debater. But I had a professor, and this is one exercise that I do in all of my classes here at UBC, at the seminar, and he would put you on stage, he'd put a podium on the stage and put you stage left or right, go to the back of the hall and yell a noun. And the minute you heard that noun, whatever it was, you had to walk slowly to the podium and give a 5-minute speech on that subject. And if you had one single hesitation, awe, or he threw you off the stage and you had to do it all over again. And he taught you to have your mind where your mouth was not. And public speaking is one of the most essential skills in any profession today. Now, my oldest daughter went to a string of private schools that nearly bankrupt her grandfather. Fortunately, he paid for everything. And then she went off to Colorado College, this pricey American private school, and got her first term paper back, and the comment was, "Is English your second language?" But Colorado College has an absolutely brilliant writing center. They recognize that this is a problem for their brilliant students that come into it, and they make that writing center accessible 24/7. They deliberately staff it with the hippest kids on campus, the musicians, the actors, the hockey players in the case of CC, and so it becomes this place where kids want to go. And we have these writing centers at all these big universities, but they're generally English as a second language. And I'm talking about skill sets for all the students. And my daughter came out of that university a very fine writer because she simply went there so I feel that, you know, if we're going to make writing the currency of the social sciences, you actually have to teach people how to write. Not one of my graduate students had ever had a paper line edited by a professor at UBC. And I found that surprising, because I spent hours with every student and I go through each line of their papers and I try my best to teach them writing. And I don't, anyway, so I think those sorts of sets, I mean, what in my personal experience, which I sort of stumbled into this public scholarship thing in a kind of serendipitous way, I always felt that the issues in my case of both biological diversity and cultural diversity were simply too important to remain sequestered in the academy. I felt that the world had to know about the plight of Indigenous people. I know that half the languages of the world were disappearing in a generation, know about the erosion of the forests of the world and so on. And I also was blessed by having a professor who didn't see the acquisition of skills such as public speaking, filmmaking, consulting, popular writing, photography. He never saw the great legendary Richard Evans Schultes. He never saw those as distractions from the core academic mission. He always saw them as complements to it. So every skill set that I've used over the last 40 years to build a very successful and lucrative career, every single skill set I learned in graduate school. And and again, not as distractions, but as complements to that core mission. I mean, Schultes believed that students had the right to publish. I mean, I had friends at Yale who were so intimidated by their professors that they never published virtually in their careers. The problem with Schultes was to get them to not publish something of yours that was ready. We had our own press, an old hand-set press in the basement that went back to 1910, and Schultes would just say, "Oh, I just put it in the leaflets." "But sir, it's not ready yet." "I don't care. You need a publication." I mean, he was like a dream weaver. I mean, he made you believe you're somebody who could do anything. And so, you know, I feel that all graduate students should be given license and encouragement to have these skill sets. And they're not beyond the reach of anybody. I mean, I became a writer in the most accidental way. I never intended to be a writer. I never took a course in creative writing in my life. I haven't taken even a course in English literature since high school. But I was in a situation where I was asked by Schultes to go down to Haiti to investigate these folk preparations implicated in the zombie phenomenon. And the intellectual head of that research was a very famous ethnopharmacologist and psychopharmacologist, really, Nathan Klein. And he was sort of the father of Prozac. He's the one who broke the back of Freud and said that some psychiatric ailments could have a chemical foundation and a pharmacological solution. And he set up a dummy foundation to support my graduate work. And I never knew where the money was coming from, but if I needed $10,000 on Wednesday night, I just had to call New York by Sunday. And it would just turn up in my bank account. And it turns out one day I went to debrief him at his Upper East Side penthouse in Manhattan, and there was a big fat kind of toad-like guy in the corner. Well, that turned out to be the sugar daddy, and that was David Merrick, the Broadway and Hollywood producer. And he had been bankrolling this entire effort, and money was no object. And then suddenly, unexpectedly, 2 years into the project, Klein died during routine heart surgery, and Merrick had a debilitating stroke 24 hours later. So I went from being flush with revenue to having none whatsoever. And I applied to NSF and all the standard agencies, but you know how long they take to decide. So I happened to remember that a journalist who I had guided across the Darien Gap had written a book about our passage. And I thought, well, Jesus, if he could write a book, I can write a book. So I walked blind into a literary agent in London. Being British, they looked down their nose at me as a Canadian and said, well, there might be something in that zombie thing. Well, before I knew it, I dictated the story into a tape recorder, had E.O. Wilson's secretary, I paid her to type it up, and before I knew it, I had a book advance from Simon & Schuster, which was like $35,000, which was more money than I had ever imagined even thinking about. So naturally, the first thing I did is I went off to Paris with my girlfriend, and then I still had some left over, and I used it to finish the research. But then I had to actually write a book, right? And I had never written anything but scientific papers in my life. And I wrote 2 chapters that I thought were best things since the Bible, and sent it to Simon & Schuster, and they sent it back to me and said, try again. Well, now I was really up against the wall, and I left Harvard. I went down to a slave cabin on a friend's farm in Virginia, and I had a limitless supply of coca leaves, which is another story, and I had my library, and I simply taught myself to write. I had at my side Hemingway for dialogue, Isaac Dinesen for atmosphere, Lawrence Durrell for kind of intrigue. I had a great story to tell because I had lived it. I just had to find the right way to tell it. So I literally, not through copying, not through plagiarism, not through mimicry, but through osmosis, I absorbed what you had to do to tell a story. And in the end, the book was written in 7 months. It was edited in a single day, and it sold 500,000 copies. So suddenly I was a writer. But I taught myself to write, and because of that, I think that anyone could do that if they're encouraged to do so. And then I got my PhD, and I went to get a postdoc, and I went through the whole rigmarole at New York Botanical Garden to get what was the best sort of field postdoc in my discipline. And I was too Canadian polite to ask, Mickey Balick, my old friend who was doing the hiring, what the salary was. So I went through the entire process of interviews and presentations and reference letters, and finally I got around to asking. He said, well, we think we can get you 19. Well, I just gotten married, my wife was pregnant, and I said, 19 what? To live in New York City? And I just made $500,000 by writing a book. So I thought, you know, Mickey, I love you, but you made a career choice for me. And that's when I set out to just try to make it as a writer. And I've always thought of myself as a storyteller, and that's what I say that as recently as when I left my Anthro 100 class with a young, wonderful kid from Kerala in India who's keen to be a photographer. I said, don't be a photographer, they don't exist anymore. Be a storyteller. You know, and what I, in a sense, through accident, engaged, is now actually becoming the norm. I mean, National Geographic photographers that are incredibly famous that you would have heard of are suffering now because there's no work in photography. Getty image stock is dead. People, friends of mine who used to get $10,000 a month from stock agencies are getting $200 a month. You know, you can't just be a photographer, you can't just be a writer, you can't just be a documentary filmmaker, you have to be a storyteller and have skill sets in all of those endeavors. And in the one thing that even as media changes, even as television is dying, even as the National Geographic sells all of its publications to Fox, which actually was the smartest thing they could ever do, it saved the institution. It got that institution $724 million for now an endowment of $1 billion to support science. It's incredible development. But again, you know, the key that will never go away, no matter how the media changes, is storytelling. You know, politicians never lead, they follow. Polemics are never persuasive, but storytellers change the world. And you think of the intellectual capital that a place like UBC graduate schools represent, and you think of the projects and the caliber of the students that I've seen even in my very brief few months here, is absolutely mind-blowing, as good as you'll find at any university in the world, as you well know. But that intellectual asset and potential, in some sense, is being squandered if we keep them ground down to a pedagogy that produces a PhD object to satisfy the interests of 3 individuals. And why should someone go to the effort to write a PhD that will just go into the circular fire? I mean, a best-selling PhD at University Microfilm sells 5 copies a year. Well, what does that do for the scholar? What does it do for the society at large? This doesn't suggest that commercial imperatives should drive everything, but relevance does matter. And there's no reason whatsoever that we shouldn't be producing documents that are camera ready for publication. I'm encouraging my students to do that. You know, every graduate student I have, their PhD or their master's, I'm hoping will go right into a book. My PhD at Harvard went directly verbatim, not a word edited, and was published by University of North Carolina Press as an academic book. So I think these kinds of outlets are going to become more and more important, and they're not difficult to connect to. And I think it would give the students, you know, so many more options. It's not a reason not to go to graduate school. On the contrary, you go to graduate school, become an entrepreneur of knowledge, and of course, it's a heck of a lot harder to write works of literary nonfiction than pedantic works of scholarship. Now, this isn't to say that in every discipline, obviously disciplines like physics and engineering and all the sciences have protocols that have to be followed for obvious reasons, and indeed so too do the social sciences. But the ultimate idea of scholarship surely is communication, at least in the social sciences. And for anthropology to continue and regain a greater sense of relevance, it's got to speak to the problems of the world. And the problems of the world, as I said, are all about culture. So that's why I think this initiative is so fantastic. I'd love to be a part of it. I'd love to share all the contacts that I've gotten with every student on campus. I mean, there's no reason, if I could have done it, anyone can do it. And, you know, it's always worth remembering that the word job comes from the medieval French word gobert, meaning to devour. And the word work comes from the Anglo-Saxon root, meaning to create and inspire. And what I say to every student is never have a job, but work harder than anyone you've ever met, and you will succeed. You know, be patient, give your destiny time to find you, recognize that orthodoxy is the enemy of invention, despair an insult to the imagination, pessimism is an indulgence. You know, the great message of the saints is that nature loves courage. You know, Jim Whittaker, the first American to summit Everest, once told me, if you're not living on the edge, you're taking up too much space. So, you know, students need to know that they can jump off that cliff, and the marvelous thing about the world is they won't come crashing down. The world will lift them up. And anything can be possible if you just work hard, follow your heart, and have something to say that the world needs to hear. Thanks.